course, my lecture is also framed around the exhibition in the way that ancient art always was a response to its contemporary time, to its own time in that way. So maybe we try basically to call out those responses when we now interact with ancient art out of its contexts. John Boardman once said that we need to try to understand art within the framework in which it was devised, no matter what functions it played after its own time. And I hope that you will try to keep that in mind as we go through a period of more than 2,000 millennia. Not 2,000 millennia, 2 millennia. 2,000 millennia would be a bit too much for classical archaeology, but 2 millennia in the time that these portraits came into existence, when they were forgotten, rediscovered by Western travelers, but they were never lost, in fact, because they held and were known by local societies even before the rediscovery of the Westerners. But you might all know at least one of these famous paintings, namely the painting of James Dawkins and Robert Wood, who are in the process of discovering Palmyra, a painting from the 18th century, painted after Dawkins was dead and his brother Henry had this done in commemoration of him. But they are practically here in the process of rediscovering the site, or the West discovering the East, so to say. They are even dressed in togas, while their local entourage are dressed in the Ottoman dresses, because at this point in time, the region that we are talking about, so modern Syria, was part of the Ottoman Empire. And it stayed that until the Mandate period, and had at that point been 400 years under Ottoman rule. But this is how Westerners imagined Palmyra at this point in time. And I should also say that the slide doesn't do justice to this painting, which is basically 4 by 4 meters, and today in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. The other one is in Australia, and gives us a good insight into the legendary framing of the famous Queen Zenobia, of which we do not have any portraits. The only portraits, so to say, of Zenobia were struck outside of Palmyra in those few years when Palmyra basically ruled Egypt, and was struck in Alexandria. But no portrait of Zenobia has been found in Palmyra. And I know that because I've looked at the 4,000 that we have. But this is the point in time also when Palmyra's art, so to say, begins to surface in Europe, or begins to seep out from Syria into European collections. And you have 3 very diverse pieces here at the Carlos Museum. The one on the left is the one that is on display, a female portrait, and I'll come back to that. The reason that the image looks like this is that this is one of the images that we, within my project, have worked with that come from the Ingholt archive, and I'll come back to this important archive again. So hopefully one day you'll get to see all 3 of these Palmyrene portraits on display. And I just calculated that you here at the museum have 0.075% of Palmyrene portraits in the world. So that's also something. Most of you, at least those of you who have experience with the Eastern Mediterranean and eastern parts of the Roman Empire, will know that Palmyra was situated in the middle of a steppe desert, so more or less halfway between the river Euphrates and the Mediterranean. Here you see a photo taken from one of the hills around Palmyra, looking at the ancient and modern city center with the oasis surrounding parts of the city. And you see the massive temple of Bel, or sanctuary of Bel, in the background right before the oasis begin. And you also see the scattered tower tombs around, and all the depressions that you see in the sand around those tower tombs are depressions of the underground tombs, namely the hypogea, from which also a lot of the funerary sculpture, of course, stem. So Palmyra and the Palmyrenes were surrounded by their deceased family members, and they were very present in the urban landscape, or at least from the urban landscape, because these tower tombs were up to 7 stories high and would have been visible to anybody approaching the city, but in fact also from the city center itself, because Palmyra was not until very late surrounded by a city wall that would have blocked the view as well for the inhabitants. We shouldn't imagine, even though it says the Syrian desert on this map, I didn't do the map, the Syrian desert as a desert as such. It's not a sand desert. And 2,000 years ago, it was a steppe desert that was also intensely cultivated at certain points of the year. And a big Norwegian project that took place before the civil war in Syria broke out focused on mapping water resources between Palmyra and the Euphrates, and actually showed how many wells, how many springs, how many cisterns, and so on and so forth that actually were. So water was also cultivated and very protected for obvious reasons, also not least for the caravan trade and for the people who moved through this landscape much more often than we would imagine if we go there today. But you'll probably know Palmyra most famously for its monumental architecture stemming from the first 3 centuries CE, because that's when Palmyra flourished. To us, it looks as if it came out of nothing, but when we do look at the archaeological evidence, of course, the evidence goes far back into the prehistoric period where there was also settlement in Palmyra. And the Hellenistic period, as so many other places in the East, remains a mystery to us, but there are still complexes like graves and a few architectural constructions, or basically foundations of buildings from this earlier period. So it did not just rise out of nothing as such, but benefited very much from the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, so to say, that brought some security to the area, which Palmyra prospered from as well. Palmyrenes built their wealth on world trade. They really were not in a large trade network that went both west, but also east, and of course also south. Here you see 2 images that give a good impression of how the Palmyrene elite saw themselves. The one to the left shows you a fragment from a front of a sarcophagus limestone box, where you see a Palmyrene man standing and holding with his left hand the prow of his ship, probably a ship that sailed in the Gulf. We know that the Palmyrenes owned ships that went to India, as far away as India. And in the other hand, he holds the reins of what was his camel, because one of his camels, you see the hoofs still on the relief. On the other sarcophagus fragment that you see to your right, you see 2 Palmyrene men with local weapons, spears, and next to them, not a caravan camel, because you wouldn't pay to put that on your grave monument, but a riding camel, and you can see that on the saddle. So an expensive animal that the elite also would ride, not only accompanying the caravans, but also taking charge of the steppe desert around Palmyra itself. Palmyrenes also had a renommee in the entire Roman Empire of being extremely good archers. They are most likely also pictured on the column of Trajan in Rome as taking part in the Trajan endeavors of Trajan in the Balkans. And here you see on your left three examples of Palmyrene men with Roman military weapons. And the one in the middle is in fact a centurion with, and you can see that on the staff that he holds in his right hand. That is a centurion staff, a vitis staff, which until recently has always been said to be a second sword, but isn't. His grave image is from the middle of the 3rd century, at a time where Palmyra really was at its height, and where Palmyrenes also played an important part in the high levels of the Roman military, at least in some parts of the empire. To the left, you see scenes from sarcophagi again, and there you see men in local Parthian influenced clothing, but with locally styled weapons. And these were probably the troops or the units that were accompanying the caravans, who also needed protection, of course, when they went through the desert and eastwards. We know a fair amount about Palmyra's trade, and we also know how trade and how goods in the city was taxed and traded. Here you see to the left images of the very famous taxery from 137 CE, one of the most important documents about social economic life in the entire Roman Empire. It is a bilingual, massive inscription, several meters long, in on the one hand Greek and Palmyrene Aramaic, that regulates trade and taxes on a number of issues in the 2nd century CE. And I can recommend, if you want to know more about that, the book published in Russian, but recently translated and edited by John Healy. But coming back to Palmyra, this society in the middle of a steppe desert where you couldn't just run away, so to say. I recently did a big hinterland study together with one of my research groups on the cultivation of the hinterland, and we also calculated how long time it would take for you to get out of the city and far enough away if you were a slave that was trying to escape and those things. Well, prospects didn't look good. It was a very tightly knit societal structure. And we see that, for example, in the funerary portraits, where sometimes family generations are mentioned in up to 7 generations back in time. Palmyrenes did not marry foreigners very often. They intermarried between the big tribal families, and one of the problems that we have with understanding the genealogy of Palmyrene families is that they, for obvious reasons, used their first names and not the family names in the graves. These were usually engraved on the grave entrance, and many of those we have lost. And there were not that many Palmyrene first names to go around. So there are certain names that are mentioned very, very often, both for women and for men, and therefore it can be quite difficult to create family genealogies. But these families were headed by family fathers or heads of family, and it was a highly bilingual society. Palmyrene Aramaic, which is a string of Aramaic, was the absolute dominating language in the public, religious, and also in the funerary sphere. But we also have more than 300 Greek inscriptions from the city set up in the public spaces, and Fergus Miller called Palmyra the only bilingual city of the Greek East. So deeply embedded into the cultural koine of the wider Greek East world. There was a very strong local religion in Palmyra. I won't talk too much about that today, but I'm finishing a book on the Palmyrene priests. So there were extensive numbers of priesthoods that circulated within these families as well. And there's absolutely no evidence for the participation of women in the priesthoods of Palmyra. When women are seen participating in religious processions, for example, they are entirely veiled. Even their faces are veiled. We have 2 examples of that. But how many people actually lived in Palmyra? And that is something that's important to understand the wealth of the city as well. The city covered approximately 120 hectares, which is a good upper mid-sized city for the period. But how many people could actually lived there? We did a population, not estimation, but we re-evaluated what other people had said and found out that people have said anything from 10,000 to 200,000 people. And that's simply just not really good enough. And that is why we did this hinterland study that we combined with a study of the development of the urban spaces and the tomb capacity and so on and so forth. So our estimate is now that between 19,000 and max 30,000 people actually lived in Palmyra in the heyday of the city in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, which is a fair amount for this sized city of the ancient world. And here you see, unfortunately, a quite small map, but you see the city center, the large sanctuary of Bel, all the big monuments situated on both sides of the main street, and then you see the cemeteries, the necropolis, scattered around the city, and you see how much they in fact make up of the space around the city as well. Palmyra was sacked by the Roman army in 272 and probably twice in 272 actually, which recently has been shown not to be 272 and 273 as always has been said. But of course, the city did continue to exist after this point in time, but it was just reduced massively. A Roman legion was installed there also, but the afterlife, or not even the afterlife, but the further life of Palmyra continued into late antiquity and of course also into the early Islamic period. And 2 good colleagues of mine have done a lot of work on that. I can recommend Emanuele Intagliata's book on Palmyra after Zenobia, and of course the book of Denis Connequin on the desert castles around Palmyra from the early Islamic period as well. So that was the setting that we are now going into and looking at some of this rich corpora of Palmyrene portraits produced over 300 years, almost over 300 years, which make up a unique corpus from the classical world because it is the largest amount of representations of individuals from the Roman period. Full stop. So it's a unique corpora of material that until now has never been collected, and I understand why. Because one person can't do that. And I also have to say I have a very strong team of PhD students and postdocs working with me, and a lot of credit goes from me to the work that they have been doing together with me on this project as well. We have, among other things, well, here you see basically the numbers as they stand today, 3,969 portraits. There are, in fact, more portraits than that, but there are parts that we cannot put into the corpus because those parts are the objects that have surfaced on the black art market, so to say, during the war in Syria and have been circulating there. We are keeping them on the side simply for ethical reasons. They will not go into the publication as such, but they are out there, and there are some very interesting and sad stories around some of them as well, but I will not go into details. What you can see here on the graph to the left is that the production of sculpture fluctuated over time, not surprisingly. I will not give you that spiel today either, but that coincides with big world events such as plagues, pandemics, wars, crises, and so on and so forth. That's not very surprising. what is to be noticed here is really that the relationship between the production divided on gender stays the same. So there are, maybe not surprisingly, most male portraits, but there's a fair amount, or more than a fair amount, of portraits of females and less of children, but the production sort of follows the same fluctuation over 300 years. I came to be interested in Palmyra when after many years abroad, I'm from Copenhagen, but I studied in various places and came back to Denmark when I got my tenured position there, and was looking to reevaluate the way that we look at portraiture from the classical world. And I wanted to find a place that had the best amount of portraits, and so to say stumbled in one of the museums that I know very well across the Palmyrene portraits that have been put in a separate department than the classical world, because that's what happens to anything that doesn't come from the borders of the Mediterranean, of course. And that's the Palmyra collection in Copenhagen, which was largely built up by Carl Jacobsen, who was a brewer, and also him and his father, the founder of the Carlsberg breweries. That's why we in Denmark have the Carlsberg Foundation today, and the Carlsberg Foundation has been endowed to the Royal Academy, where I'm a member. So basically, and that is not even a lie, we are not allowed to drink wine in the Academy, but only beer. But if one can say anything positive about alcohol, a large part of the shareholdings goes back into research. So in that way, and that's also not an advertisement, but it's the Carlsberg Foundation who basically have paid for these 12 years of research. No research foundation would have done that, because they would have found this a really boring project. So I'm saying this to philanthropists and to funders. I mean, fund boring projects, because you'll see what difference it makes for the humanities and for our understanding of the ancient world also. Denmark is a small nation. We are just hitting 6 million inhabitants now. In the 19th century, there was fewer Danes, but Danes have always traveled the world, and to the left you see Johannes Elit Østrup, who, as one of the first Danes, after Carsten Niebuhr, of course, much earlier, traveled from Cairo to Copenhagen on horseback. And that was also the Carlsberg Foundation who funded his horses. He spent time in the desert east of Damascus and came to Palmyra also. And here in Danish, in his travel account, describes the vandalism, both the iconoclasm, but also the greediness of Western collectors who basically carry half of the blame of the site being ruined. Then he goes on to say that he's going to buy a few of the sculptures himself and take back to Denmark. But he even basically gives prices in francs that greedy Brits would pay to take sculptures back to their country. So that's also a very Danish thing, to be a little bit uncritical of one's own way of behaving out in the world. But it's this collection that basically brought me to the crazy idea of collecting all the portraits from Palmyra in the world. And there I committed my second big mistake when I told the Carlsberg Foundation that probably around 1,500 of these would exist in the world. And now we are up to 4,000. And that's basically why it's taken so long time. But I was also lucky to, together with curators at the Glyptotek for the first time ever, to put this entire collection on display in 2019. So a year before the pandemic hit. And actually, it was very interesting to get to work with the objects again here. And that's also one of the reasons why I'm happy to be here today and see one of them on display, because very often these are simply put in storage and not becoming part of the narrative of the wide range of traditions, stylistic traditions in the Mediterranean world. Harald Ingholt, one has to mention him as well because he was a fabulous Danish scholar born in the late 19th century, had a brilliant career and excavated in Palmyra. And it's his archive that a lot of our basis material has come from that we have in the Palmyra Portrait Project. I don't know whether you can read the letter there, but that's basically from the head librarian in Yale. And I have to admit I can't see it with my glasses from here, and I also can't see it here. Maybe I can see it because one just has to read a few of these lines because it tells you something about the man behind this massive archive. When we in the library heard that you were retiring, we were of two minds. On the one hand, we thought we might be able to reduce our staff at the circulation desk. And on the other, we worried for fear you might step up your activities in the library now that you're relieved of your teaching responsibilities. We also worried about a possible shelving crisis should you return all your books at once. I'm sure that a lot of you recognize that situation, but it also shows that librarians have great humor, also at Yale. But Ingholt worked in Palmyra in the 1920s under French concession because it was just the beginning of the French mandate in Palmyra. So he did several campaigns there, and it's basically his material we've worked on. So he worked exclusively in the necropolis around Palmyra. The French worked in Palmyra itself, and one of the first things that the French did was to clear the entire modern village of Palmyra and move the entire local population out of their homes. They actually employed them to destroy their own village, moved them out in concrete buildings so that they could restore the Temple of Baal to its Roman glory. I just think that this is an important story to bring up because we talk about the magnificent Roman ruins of Palmyra, but that is a Palmyra that has been deconstructed through time, and where the mandate period, of course, also carries a big responsibility for the heritage that also went lost in that process. And I just think it's important because, cultural heritage never stays the same. There's always a process of construction and deconstruction. But this is one of the stories that we do not look at very often. And here you just see aerial photographs from 1929, 1930, 1934, where the village, where there were more than 500 families living, is entirely cleared out. These are images from Ingholt's archive that shows you part of that village before it's deconstructed. And of course, in French archives in Paris, there is much more material about this deconstruction, and also about how people were remunerated or not when they were moved out of their houses. But that takes me to the Ingholt archive, which came to the Glyptotek in Copenhagen in the 1980s when Ingholt donated it there, and has been standing there since then. And when I found the portraits, I found the archive, and that is what a lot of the portrait work has been based on. But I won't go into details with that, because that's all published. And if you're interested in seeing that, you can see it both online, but also in what I think is beautiful publications. Not that you need to run out and buy them because they're very data heavy, but they're out there available for everybody. In his archives and in his diaries, Ingholt, of course, gives us a lot of information about the local people he worked with, the way that he interacted with them, the way that he also bought antiquities from them, the way that they were gifted to him, and so on and so forth. And very recently, I did a count of how these objects flowed together with two of my colleagues, Jen Bird and Sina Kamash, how these objects flowed through the years, how many he excavated himself, and you can see the table down there, how many he bought or were shown. And of course, some of them we also don't know how he acquired. And there you can see that a fair amount of the objects that Ingholt brought back to Denmark or to Yale from his excavations actually were bought from local workers in local contexts. And these are also some of the stories that are never told in archaeological publications. The stories of how the local knowledge is not integrated into the archaeological narrative. But luckily enough, Ingholt actually noted those things in his diaries. And this is one of the reasons that I think that working with legacy data is also sort of an archaeological excavation and what I like to call archive archaeology. So based on this archive and all the other collection research we've done, we can now say that there are at least 235 collections that hold Palmyrene objects around the world today. And we're hitting, about the 4,000 of these portraits, which do not include the ones on the so-called black markets or the ones that we don't get to know anything about. And on that basis, now we can also divide those on the funerary sphere and the public and religious sphere. And you can see that there's not so much left from outside the graves. And why is that? Where did all that sculpture go? Here you just see some slides from the main street and side streets of Palmyra. And you see these beautiful statue consoles, which is a very Palmyrene feature. I mean, it exists in Palmyra as well, also in Syria and in a few other places, but not to the extent that it does in Palmyra. So not only were statues placed at the base of columns, in front of the columns, but also halfway up on the columns. So Palmyra was one big portrait gallery to an extent that we have a hard time imagining. So no matter where you were in the city, you would have mostly male statues looking down at you, produced either in the local limestone or in imported marble or even bronze as well. So from the public and religious sphere, we only have 248 objects with portraits, and I won't go into them now in any detail. Of course, we also have some imported marble sculpture left, but a lot of that had been used in late antiquity for lime slacking, so burnt to basically being a binder in buildings in late antiquity. And marble was also not an indigenous, or is not an indigenous stone in that part of the world, so all marble had to be imported from very far away. And imagine that there are even 4 Attic sarcophagi in Palmyra. They weigh around 3 tons each. To have transported one of those through the desert from the Mediterranean coast, that takes some organization and financial resources. Bronze has also been remelted, and here I just show you an interesting example on the right side, because we have 6 examples of Palmyrene limestone sculpture that mimics bronze working techniques and actually shows us the level of knowledge of the local craftsmen in Palmyra. And I say this because Palmyrene portraiture is often said to be provincial. There was nothing provincial about Palmyrene portraiture. It was just doing what it wanted to do, and that was being a riot of styles that drew on knowledge of Greek art, of Roman fashions, and of course also of fashions from the East, but integrating that into its completely own local interpretation of what a portrait was. These are a few of the statues left from the public sphere and produced in the local limestone. And so we really have to imagine, like that single statue that has been replaced up on that console, that Palmyra was filled of these. But most of the portraits that we have come from the funerary sphere. They are also mostly these loculus reliefs, but there I also want to say that almost 800 sarcophagi, limestone sarcophagi, exist or were made in Palmyra. Well, of course, many also have gone lost. And they are the most lavish monuments you can imagine, with up to 13 people, full scale, shown on the list on the lids of these sarcophagi. So these comprised family images. But most often, Palmyrenes used loculus reliefs, which were set up in front of their burial slot. Mummification was the burial custom in Palmyra, set into these either high tower tombs or very large underground tombs that could be expanded over generations as well, the underground tombs, of course. So we've counted almost 500 tombs in Palmyra, and that's a staggering number. Some of them could hold up to 400 burials. Of course, we are not sure that all of these were ever entirely filled, but also were an elite expression of being able to afford these spaces, especially the towers, because I'm sure you would know that tower belonged to the family of Elabel and that one to the one of Hairan, whatever. So the towers were also very visual identities of the elite families as well. Here you see a slide of these loculus niches without portraits in them from the very famous Tomb of the Three Brothers, and one of the very few mummies that we have left from Palmyra. This is one that actually came to Denmark, but with Carl Jacobsen's collection, but dissolved when it arrived because, of course, it couldn't survive that trip, and today does not exist in this way. And there are 4 other mummies supposedly in Palmyra, but of course we don't know that. Graves in Palmyra were either these tower tombs, the lavish hypogea, or even later became these very lavish temple or house tombs that again reached back into time and incorporated classical ideas of displaying deceased family members in very local traditions, but combined with Greco-Roman architecture. And I'll show you a very striking example as well. But what I want to say with these 2 graphs is just that about 1% of all the grave sculpture is in situ. So that's not a lot. And that's because people always ask me, well, what about all these names and genealogies? Well, it's very difficult when they were called the same. They're out of context. We don't know where they come from. But there are some interesting family story examples that we might come back to. But here again, of course, Inghold's diaries, in the case of the 80 graves that he excavated but didn't publish, he published 5 graves, but he excavated 80, gave us a lot of information about various in situ situations. And I don't have time to go into details about that, but we'll just take a few case studies to show you what it is that we've been able to do with this legacy data. And I start with the most famous sculpture from Palmyra, namely the so-called Beauty of Palmyra, where fierce disputes until I found Harald Inghold's diaries had been going on between now deceased academics who had been spending a lot of their time writing about why this sculpture could not have come from the grave Inghold has said it came from because he had forgot to put in a footnote or whatever. But in his diary, there are pages that describe the day that he finds this bust with the team that he works with in the Qasr Abjad. And here I've just taken the line of the diary out where he says that this is the most beautiful female sculpture he has seen thus far. And one has to say, I've spent a lot of time with Inghold's diaries. He is not a man of emotions. So this is actually taking it to the heights of, he must have been really impressed. And if you've ever seen the sculpture in the Glyptotek, you will also know that it does make an amazing impression on one. Polychromy studies has been done on it recently in connection with the exhibition that we did, and it is actually coated in real gold that's laid over deep red colors, so on and so forth. There were probably plaster stones set inlaid in the very lavish jewelry, so on and so forth. Now, through the diaries, we can place this sculpture back into its architectural environment, which was the so-called Qasr Abyad, the White Castle, called so by locals because it was a very significant building in one of the most remote places of one of the necropolis around Palmyra, but built in very large, white, very polished limestones. In antiquity, it probably was plastered, potentially also colored on the outside, definitely on the inside, so on and so forth. So it's not that we need to imagine that it was standing so stark white as it was in later times. But as you see here on this more recent photo by Ross Burns, taken before the war in Syria, the grave had degraded very much over the decades also, but you still get an impression of some of the classicizing architecture within which this very beautiful and definitely not Greco-Roman influenced sculpture was set. But when we then look at all the until now unpublished sculpture that we also found in the archive, the story begins to become a bit more interesting in the way that it's a combination of local dress sculpture in the round, which is very rare in Palmyra, combined with more Greco-Roman female busts in this case, and a woman with a child. You see that down on the left side. Here again, we are working from images of sculpture that doesn't exist anymore, and Ingholt didn't find these pieces interesting enough to publish. But when you put them all together, also with the inscriptions and the architecture, we can now say that the beauty, so to say, have stood or have blocked our view with her beauty of the contextualization in a society that was extremely aware of cultural trends from the entire world around them, not just the Parthian sphere, which has been the argument for the 3rd century until now. Another case is the Hypogeum of Hayran, where we could place back in their context these now lost wall paintings of Hayran and his wife, and you will see that they are standing on statue bases. These wall paintings accompanied the portrait busts of Hayran and his wife, and I will just show you the small, very rudimentary 3D reconstruction we did of that grave, where we embedded the legacy data from Ingholt's diaries and the archives with a plan of the grave that we could optimize on the basis of his diaries, and also replaced, as you will see here, the wall paintings in Hayran's niche that was embedded in a much larger grave than was set until then, because Hayran's grave, it was in fact only Hayran's niche in a much, much larger grave. But what's important here with these wall paintings is really that this is an example of bringing the public sphere into the grave, because these were most likely the honorific statues that were standing out on Palmyra's street or in the agora, but Hayran brought them into the grave with him, and his wife or his family would have done that for him after they were dead. So again, a mix of an awareness of the Greco-Roman honorific tradition that's even brought into the Palmyrene grave in this case. And my last example here from the legacy data comes from Ingholt's excavation of the Hypogeum of Athenathan, where one of the very famous sarcophagi come from. And as you can see here, Ingholt actually spent quite a bit of time drawing the colors that he found on the sarcophagus. And when you see Palmyrene sculpture today, of course, most of it is stark white or gray or yellowish, but we have to imagine that the portraits were a riot of colors. And here you just see a few of the surviving polychrome portraits out there. There are many more that carry traces, but these are some of the best examples. The woman in the middle, you even see that her skin has been colored slightly light brown, yellowish, and features like jewelry, so on and so forth, could be highlighted. So we have to imagine these effects in these dark graves where no natural light was available, but only artificial. And in that way, the colors would have worked very dramatically also. So we can now give a really, really good overview of the various groups of sculpture, when they were produced, stylistic developments, and of course also dress codes over time, which gives a completely new insight into, well, on the one hand, what fashions Palmyrenes like to wear, at least in their grave portraits and their grave statues, but also how that changed over time. And I could probably speak about that for half a year, so I will spare you for that now, because I know that we need to come to a close. But I want to, as the very, very last, take you back to your own piece, so to say, and just show you one of these boring graphs again before I show you something exciting. But the exciting thing about these boring graphs is really that we now can map the relationship between gender and how many men. Palmyrene priests make up a huge part of the corpora. Well, because that was an elite status basically to hold. Women are very present in the funerary sphere. 33% of the sculpture shows women. In the public sphere, only 17%. So that also shows something about female roles in the public and in the private sphere or the family sphere, so to say. And here I just show you a graph that also shows very significantly that women were not just attributes to their husbands, because the largest amount of portraits show women on their own. And nobody can say that the woman that you see to the left is not a powerful image of a Palmyrene elite woman. So that is taking me back to your own piece, which is one of the few quite early pieces left. And while it might not look as lavish as some of these late 2nd and 3rd century women with a lot of jewelry, it tells us a lot about the introduction of the portrait habit in Palmyra. And so I urge you to go and look at this in real life when you can, and ask it for a response to the call that I hope that I have now put out here of the important role of this unique corpus of Palmyrene funerary portraiture that still needs to be embedded entirely into our understanding of the ancient world, and not just as an add-on or a fancy phenomenon from an Eastern province. So thank you very much for your attention.